Yes. Hi, friends. Good morning. Uh, Welcome for a conversation on the RBI's financial stability report, something which assumes so much of significance given where our economy is. So, this is something which RBI brings out, I believe, every half year, and it gives a status on the macros and how various parts of the economy are moving and in what direction. So quickly moving on, I would thank Graceland and Jugal for their efforts. These are the terms which we have used. We shall be seeing them in some detail as we move on. So the report is reasonably voluminous. I wouldn't say it's too long. It's about 130 pages. So we've split that into two parts. So the first part is what we would be looking at this point in time. So today's agenda would be a quick overview on what RBI feels is the direction in which the economy and the markets are headed. What are the macro financial risks, and also looking at the global numbers wherever relevant. And then we would be looking at the domestic macro financial developments and the resilience of scheduled commercial banks. Now, this is where the real black swan is, because thanks to Supreme Court, most of the domestic institutions have not uh, shown the real picture for NPAs, and of course, we would understand what the interim conclusion is. So, the 22nd Financial Stability Report, which is again a half yearly publication, was released, and the aggregate banking credit has remained sort of muted. Obviously, because there was a period of 6 months of uncertainty, moratoriums, none of us knew what was going to happen, and this points to the risk aversion technique, which is where you would see banks are now flushed with. I was reading another report by my professor where currently banks have over 6 lakh crores of liquidity which is lying. Though the banks reported much better anticipated results reflecting monetary relaxation measures, the full impact of deterioration on the bank's asset quality is likely to unfold gradually, because one, the moratorium period pushed has given reasonably good amounts of breathing space for MSMEs, much deserved. But what has also happened is Supreme Court in the month and early this, I think in December, on a PIL filed has restricted banks from recognizing NPAs of those accounts which even post August were delinquent. So now we'll wait and watch for how the impact of that judgment is going to be on the overall financials of banks. Let's look at the global macro perspective. Just a sec, friend. I don't know why it's not coming. Um, I think there's some issue with the. Where to look at the macro financial developments and their outlook. What I'll just give me a sec. I'll just do a screen share. I think there the presentation is far better. Okay, so if we were to look at this globally, 2020 is expected to be about minus 4.4% shrinkage in the GDP, in the global economy, and there is a projected growth of about 5.2% for 2021. But what this 5.2 is also, it's an average number. It is not a number which would equally apply. So most of the global economies are expected to be below the 2019 levels even in 2021. And if you see the growth projections, India is expected to grow at 8.8, China at 8.2%. This is again for 2021. UK at 5.9 and US at 3.1. And most of the central banks have focused on lavish stimulus packages, and some of them have been dedicated to fiscal spending on loans, investments, and other measures. And the fall in policy rates as a result of central bank interventions have eased the financial conditions. So that's one thing you would see globally. The interest rates have plummeted, and India is no different. You're able to have a home loan at 6.75%, which I believe is happening for the first time in the last 15 years. The financial stress index have moved further into negative territory since July 2020, indicating below average stress levels. And the impact of decline in term rates due to massive infusion of central bank liquidity. Now, here I would like to slightly digress from the presentation and discuss about a concept called quantitative easing. And that's something you would have read. It's nothing but the central bank printing loans and printing notes, and the government issuing treasury bills against it. So this is a case what we call as monetization of debt, and US is so far done somewhere about 10% of the GDP as monetization. And the Biden's first announcement was also to bring out another $800 billion of free money into the market. Now, all these, what it has done is it significantly brought down the borrowing costs. While there is a tendency for inflation to go up because of monetization, given the overall deflationary trend, it is expected that the inflation would remain more or less at this point. And if inflation doesn't go up, the interest rates also more or less likely to remain subdued. And what's also interesting to understand is if central banks are the largest borrowers, so obviously their interest rates, keeping interest rates lower would be central bank across the world. I'm saying are the largest issuers of notes, and the central governments are the largest borrowers. It is in the government's interest to keep the interest rates low. So I believe they would end up doing whatever it is to keep that low. We saw what happened in Japan for a span of 20 years. So capital flows and exchange rate volatility. If you look at the response of foreign investors on primary issues in the emerging markets have been fairly aggressive. You will see that from below. Anticipating post-vaccine era movements, US yields of intermediate tenures, which is 2 to 5 years, have started to move higher, and this could have future portfolio flows to emerging markets. So, what typically this means is whenever the interest rates increase in US treasury bills, there is a tendency for monies to move away, the foreign portfolio investments to move away from emerging markets to the US markets, because one, it's a sovereign backed bill, and if the yields there improve, the risk free returns are absolute, and that's where long term money flows. Bank stock prices plummeted, and but they are still yet to get back to their pre-COVID levels, whereas industries like pharma, tech have zoomed. Although US and European banks contingent convertible bonds have recovered sharply post the COVID lows, funding costs for such instruments are still recovering and are relatively high. While the growth in bank loans in Asia remained robust, which is largely driven by a sharp recovery in China. US banks have been aggressive in loan loss provisioning. You would see that from the right hand side table. The movement in aggregate loan loss reserves, the top line is the US banks. So for Q2 and Q3 2020, they have significantly moved on in terms of their provisioning. Whereas same is what they've done with UK banks, but they're not as much as what the US, but they're still substantially higher than their European and Asian counterparts here. This is a peak on the movement in bank stocks. Across the bank, pricings have gone up, except if you look at SBI, ICICI has zoomed past, HDFC has zoomed past. So SBI again has zoomed past. But again, if you were to compare March 2020, these numbers would tell you a different story. If you see the commodity market spillovers now, this is an area of concern. The global demand for oil is expected to be 97 million barrels per day, and that's about 3% lower than 2019. And the volatility in the commodity prices has had a significant impact on commodity exporting countries. So, nearly 90%, 91% of these commodity exporting countries are treated as low income, are categorized as low income. So, a volatility in pricing could have an impact on their budgeted revenues. and how they would in turn manage their commitment costs. So those things are we'll have to wait and see how that pans out over time. A continued slump in commodity prices would have serious fiscal sustainability issues for these jurisdictions. All sub indices of the food price index registered gains in November, with vegetable oil rising the most. You would see that on the next slide, as we would see, followed by those of sugar, cereals, and dairy meat. So, if you see the fiscal deficit, so which is typically the excess of expenditure over income, that's what we call as deficit. So, in commodity of low income countries, India is also in that space. So, the low income developing Asia, which is where India falls in, for 2020, it's estimated to be about minus 6.32% of GDP, whereas India was about 3.5%. That's excluding the off balance sheet, but including the off balance sheet items like what the Food Corporation of India carries, or uh, your sovereign backed debts, the debts of the states as well, it would definitely be about 8 to 10%. So we are in that in that higher end of the fiscal deficit bracket for the low income developing Asia. For Latin America, it's much lower. And even in developing sub-Saharan Africa, that's below the Saharan Sahara Desert region in Africa, again, it's around 5% for 2021 estimate. So if you look at the commodity prices, the indices of market prices for commodities, you would see that by and large, the prices have come down, except for, let's say, cereals have increased, vegetable oil is increased, meat has come down by about 7-8% since Q1 2020. Over the last 6 months, is what is a comparison. Sugar has come down by about 10%. Beverages have remained constant. Agricultural raw materials have come down by 4%. Cotton has come down by 6%. Rubber has increased by about 11%. Wool has come down by almost 30%, if not more, 35%. Fertilizers again have come down by 5-6%. Metals have increased thanks to gold, precious metals, which has gone up about 15%. Coal has come down significantly by almost 30-35%. So that would give you a perspective, because most of the lower income countries are dependent on commodity exports, and a dip or a volatility in the prices is likely to have serious macro consequences on their fiscal sustainability. Now let's start looking at closer home in terms of domestic macro financial developments. Yes, GDP is expected to shrink by about 7.5, 7.7%. Let's see what our honorable finance minister has to offer in a week, in about a couple of weeks from now. Sorry, less than that. The government revenue shrunk by about 18% from April to November, but post that, if you see the GST revenues from October to December have registered robust growth. So that's some solace. Fiscal deficit, there is a large uh, gap which is expected to be filled in by government borrowings in the bond market and liquidity support measures of RBI. Let's wait and watch what that number is likely to be. Current account, again, it's on current revenues and expenses. With weakening domestic demand, the current account surplus increased to 3.1% of GDP. So, what typically means is we have not imported much. So, we used to import a lot of oil, but for the first 6 months, since the country was in a state of lockdown, so at least for personal mobility, requirements of oil was significantly reduced. There was a sharp rebound in imports by 7.6% in December. Again, we would see the statistics. And there's been a narrowing of trade deficit during Q3 from 34.3 billion to 34.3 billion from 37.1 billion. It's about 7-8% shrinkage. So this is the foreign trade. India, as we know, is still a net importer, thanks to oil being one of the largest contributories. So if we look at it for the month of June, we've imported significantly lower, but it's gone up over the last 6 months. Thanks. It also shows that we are getting back on track. Exports have remained more or less consistent. So, and that's where the deficits also, trade deficit of almost 30 to 40,000 crores per month. See the term curve, the overnight secured funding rate for market transaction, which is 10 to 15%, 15 bips, 0.1 to 0.15 bips lower than the reverse repo rate, has fallen sharply. And the unsecured overnight call rate, which was generally in the reverse repo MSF corridors, also fallen below the reverse repo rate from around the same time. So consequent to it, the risk-free money market term structure, specifically at the shorter end of the curve, has consistently touched negative spreads over the reverse repo. So, uh, which if you look at it, friends, I'll give you this piece where you try to compare the 3 month to 3 year slope. That's the gray on the right hand side of the on the right hand side table. So this talks about the spread between a 3 month treasury bill and the 3 year G6 spread. So which if you follow it, since Jan 19, the overnight market repo rate has softened from 6.37 to 3.03, while the 3 month treasury bill 3 to 3 year G6 spread has widened from 43 bips to 133 bips, implying that the softening of 3 month T-bill rates has been the main driver of the steeper yield curve up to the 3 year tenor. And again, this softening of yield curve is also thanks to excessive liquidity in the markets. This would show FPI stands for foreign portfolio investment. That's the money which comes into India uh, as investments in the Indian stock market. You would see in the month of March, uh, both from the equity and the debt side, there was a massive pullout. And then you would see again, beginning from July, August onwards, there's been marginal pump backs, but I think November, December have been one of the highest as far as the equity inflows are concerned. Similarly, when we look at the domestic institutional investors, those guys were the largest investors in the month of March, so obviously they would have made a killing. And you would see them pulling out in the month of November and December. So they expect the markets to uh, uh, correct a bit, which is why you've seen them pull out. But foreign institutional investors have entered the markets in a long way in November and December. Exchange rate movements and realized volatility. So the movement of currencies, so rupees appreciated against the dollar um, by about 3.5%. This is like December over June. And the movements in INR and 1 month historical realized volatility. So you could see that the 1 month volatility is about 3.5%. And the movements have been over the last 12 months. The band has been from 71 to 77. And USD movements have remained around that range, but yes, there's for an aberration up to 88, but that's a very small aberration once. But beyond that, it's been around the 73, 75 range. If you look at the corporate sector, friends, there's a contraction in sales in to the tune of 4.3%. Although the profit margins improved across sectors, manufacturing companies reduced leverage. So this is something which was happening for two reasons. One, there was um, capacity surplus available, so there was no need for them to improve their capex, so their leverage, so fresh loans were not being borrowed. And institutions which already had borrowed at higher rates, thanks to lower significant rapidly reducing pricing, their motivation was to repay the loans um, uh, by deploying further cash towards repayment rather than keeping it on hold, keeping it for acquisitions or investments. So a sample of 2,888 listed non-financial entities from March 15 to September 20 shows significant worsening of the ratio of interest to EBITDA, and OA stands for other amortizations in the wake of pandemic. So if you look at the interest to EBITDA ratio, it has come down. So it went up and then it went up to as much as 14% of EBITDA, and then it's fallen down to about 6-7% by September. And again, an analysis of smaller common set of 1,700 listed non-PSU and non-financial companies reflects the increasing role of non-banks in funding their balance sheet expansion. So that's the other piece to look at. So where NBFCs are making a big inroad into the bastions which were thus far considered to be the banking piece. Again, the chart on the left hand side is important. So the number of obligors or borrowers who were downgraded has significantly gone up over the last 4 quarters. The number of obligors who were upgraded fell sharply, and upgrade to downgrade ratio is maintained at 0.1 to 0.2. So still a larger chunk of borrowers have been downgraded, which increases the risk for the financial sector. If you look at the banking credit, friends, with the onset of COVID-19, again, the retail credit has suffered, obviously, because people have not been in a position to move out or buy, or the entire focus was on to conserve cash. The retail credit growth has suffered, while wholesale credit growth has held up through at low levels. Again, credit growth in respect of public sector undertakings was comparatively resilient during the pandemic, although the aggregate PSU credit exposure declined between March to September. So this is something which is consistently happening, especially in the case of large value loans. The PSU exposures are coming down. The market cap of central public sector enterprises has, however, fallen despite being a bull run. And an analysis of wholesale credit flow suggests that non-PSU obligors reveal sharp deleveraging, that is, repayment of debt, um, at ratings of AA and above. So all the good companies have been repaying debt across both PSUs and non-PSU and private banks. And this reflects a reversal from the position in March 2020, when a rush to access credit was observed in the early phase of the pandemic breakout. And if we were to look at the charts below, the credits by scheduled commercial bank, you see the annual growth. Retail credit has come down. The green line has come down by from 20% to almost 9.9%. So it's been a degrowth of more than 50%. If you see the wholesale credit, it was about 5.5, 6 to 7%. It's come down to 3.7%, and a degrowth of 40%. And if you see the overall credit, the growth was about 10% plus in March 18, and it's come down to 5.3% in September 20. And if you see the market cap of central public sector enterprises and the credit offtake, market cap at the BSE level, CPSE market cap has plummeted from about 15 lakh crores in March 17. It's plummeted to almost half that number now. And for for CPSE bank credit, it's from under a lakh crore. It's now hovering around 4 lakh crores. That's where it is, but not very encouraging though, friends. A size-wise disaggregation of wholesale credit points to deleveraging by large wholesale borrowers. Even as the smaller borrowers, that's like, when we say small, it's between 5 to 10, 100 crores. They continue to record sustained credit appetite. So, which is where the MSME credit flows are basically. And if we were to analyze the sectoral credit growth, specifically to those that are critical in terms of gross value added, it shows resilient flows to sectors such as construction, trade, and hospitality, while bank credit remained muted to the manufacturing sector. And the overall demand for consumer credit, as reflected in inquiry volumes, remained depressed since the onset of the pandemic. The approval rates were low during Q1 2020-21, obviously, but they've improved. But still, I mean, I think at that time for Q1, the 20% which the government gave was one of the better possibilities to be worked with. And if you are to look at the sectoral credit growth, this is an interesting one, friends. So agriculture contributes 15.8%, and the credit growth for that sector has remained about 4.5 to 5% for the year. Mining and quarrying, 3% it contributes, and it's good that the sector has gone up. The credit growth has gone up in October 20. Manufacturing has been a damn squib, contributes almost a fifth of the GDP, but the credit growth has been negative for the year. Electricity and utilities contributing 2.3%. Again, credit growth has been negative for the year. Construction, 8.5%. Credit growth has been about 4 to 5%. Trade, repair, hotels, and restaurants contributing 13.4% of the GVA, and the credit growth has been robust in that space, to upwards of double digits. Transport, storage, communication, and services related to broadcasting is about 7% GVA. And strangely, in the month of October, it's been negative, but I think we see record quarters for all the auto companies so far. So, and financial services, um, which typically mean bank credit to at the NBFC sector, which contributes about 6.5% in GVA. That's the growth has come down, but it's still at a healthy 9% at this point. Real estate is another sector where which contributes significantly to our GVA, but there the growth has come down from 13.8% in March to 7.3% in October. And if we see the volume of inquiries for MSME credit, so the overall volumes, yes, it was very low in the month of May 2020, obviously, but now it's marginally picking up at 2.8%. If we were to look at the developments in the NBFC sector, one, the RBI special liquidity window for mutual funds provided a large measure of relief and eased liquidity stress for the sector. The normalized debt fund NAVs of various categories, which showed up a sharp dip in March, April, in the wake of redemption, because at that point in time, all the debt mutual funds were in for literally like a bank run, where every investor wanted to redeem and take the funds out. The average AUM of money market mutual funds have expanded in line with system level liquidity. The share of liquid assets in debt mutual fund portfolios has surged since March 2020 and constitutes almost 40% of aggregate AUM, again, which effectively means that the mutual funds are prepared for a redemption run. The commercial paper outstanding for non PSU obligors has increased sizably, reflecting liquidity support from RBI. And if you were to look at this, friends, the investment in GSEC, T bills, and your CP, commercial paper, corporate debt as a percentage of debt to AUM, which is the orange one, which is the commercial paper and corporate debt, that's plummeted from 33% to almost 8%. And if you were to look at the GSEC, which is the central government security, from about around 15%, it's now moved up to 80%, which clearly shows the risk wariness of the funds. So they're okay to forego some yield for the sake of protection. And there's a sharp decline in money market rates, specifically since April. It's opened up a significant wedge in the marginal cost of fund-based MCLR versus money market rates of the corresponding tenure. So this would give you a perspective. The 3 months MCLR, which is a blue line, has been hovering around 8% to 7%, 6.8%, whereas the treasury bill yields are now hovering around 3% thereabout. So that clearly shows the wedge between the two, and that's where the spread also lies, and also the perception of risk. The housing market is gradually rebalancing and recovering from the trough into which it had plunged, because there was a sudden glut of stoppages. New units launched and residential units sold across the top 8 cities reflected clear recoveries. So if you were to look at the chart below, the sales are the blue ones. The sales are low. They are in terms of number of units, they are currently hovering, if you were to see, about 35 to 40,000 units. And the current launches are significantly muted compared to the past. But what's interesting is there is a movement from Q1 to Q2. Things are looking better, and I think once things the sentiments improve, I think we are in for a mad rush. Soundness and resilience, scheduled commercial banks. Again, this is something which is important for all of us to understand how safe are our banks. Now, before that, if we see the sector-wise loans, the share of loans as far as March 2020, as at March, so agriculture had about 9%. The credit growth in Q2 is about 18%. So that's from a minus 22% in Q1. So that's positive. Industry occupies 35%, and the credit growth has been negative. That's a cause for concern, negative 15%. Same as it gives services. which occupies 38%, and the credit growth is at minus 10% thereabout. So, if you look at it, friends, almost 73% chunk industry and services, the credit growth has been significantly negative. Personal loans have moved up from minus 60% to plus 4.2% from Q1 to Q2. So, on the whole, we are looking at a negative of minus 7.5% for Q2. And if we were to look at the components of scheduled commercial banks' profit growth, you would see net interest income is about 16.2% as of September 20, and EBIT is at 17.6%. So there has been like a good shift, you would say, in terms of the mix of components. Especially the other operating income has plummeted compared to March 20 and September 20, and provisions have been negative, except there's been a marginal improvement in provision in September. That's primarily because of moratorium and the Supreme Court issue. I think once they are in place, this will fall. The return on equity also for all scheduled commercial banks is now at 8.1%. There again, I wouldn't believe this number much because of the inaccuracy of the provision terms. So credit growth has declined. So that's typically where we are as far as the credit and deposit growth is concerned. The gross and net NPAs are they stood at 7.5 and 2.1% respectively. But again, I wouldn't trust these numbers too much at this point in time. The provision coverage ratio of scheduled commercial bank improved to 72% from 66%. The capital to risk weighted ratios and tier 1 leverage ratio of SCBs have increased. However, the actual capital cushion available with banks could be overstated in view of regulatory forbearance. So that's where the real meat is. If you were to look at the asset quality trends, friends, growth in gross NPAs as of now is predicted to be at negative 15%. Let's wait and watch for the real numbers to come. Growth in NPA provisions is at 0.2%. Capital to risk weighted ratio as of September is at 15.8%, and in this, foreign banks score significantly higher than PSBs and private sector banks. And the tier 1 leverage ratio, here again, foreign banks score far higher than the other institutions. And if you see the sectoral asset quality, the industry has the highest stressed assets ratio. Agriculture follows next, services at third place, and retail at the lowest. So retail credit in India is significantly more efficient and rewarding. And if you see, the share of retail loans is about 14%. So out of the overall 100%, 14% of the loans have remained fairly risk free. Credit quality of large borrowers, now that's always been a concern. Where, I mean, I still remember when we were looking at the Insolvency Act, about 7 or 8 loans had almost 80% of the largest, I mean, of the or 60% of NPAs. So that's where the focus was on. Something very similar to that. The share of large borrowers in the aggregate loan portfolios of scheduled commercial bank, they were in the downward trajectory. That's primarily because PSU banks have stopped or are gradually bringing down their exposure to large value loans of corporates. The share of restructured advances increased, indicating that large borrowers have commenced availing restructuring benefits extended for COVID-19 stressed assets. But from what we see, the post Kamath committee report implications have not been very significant. We are doing a research report on that as well. The proportion of substandard and doubtful advances contracted, while that of loss assets increased, reflecting aging of the NPA portfolio. The top 100 large borrowers accounted for 17 and 33% of scheduled commercial banks' cross advances and large borrower loans, respectively. And large advances in the SMA 0 category registered a quantum jump. So that's where, like, over the previous quarter, portending slippages in the ensuing quarters. Now, these are the concerns what we have. So the growth in SMAs and uh, NPAs of large borrowers. So you would see that in the table to the right hand side, September there's been a large spike of almost 155% in the SMA 0, and SMA 1 has gone up by 19%. 2 at 2%. That's not much. Standard restructured is at 2.2, but I think the rest are all in the zero to negative zone. So if you were to look at this, friends, although there has been a rapid recovery from the lows of March and April, it was bound to happen. Major non-financial indicators remain below pre-pandemic levels. Increased sovereign debt for the purpose of stimulus have intensified concerns on sustainability. But here we would say that India has been one of the better and more responsible jurisdictions, especially in the way they have managed the debt. With stress tests pointing to deterioration in asset quality of banks, early indication, identification of impairment, and aggressive capitalization as imperatives for supporting credit growth across various sectors, alongside preemptive strategies for dealing with potential NPAs. And once the Supreme Court verdict is also out, we'll understand the true magnitude of the debts at this point. So these were some of our thoughts, friends, and thought it would make sense for us to understand the the FSR report. So we'll catch up again tomorrow on another conversation of relevance. Thank you for the second part of this.